Hello, everybody, and welcome to SOAR's final Psych Talk of the semester. Thank you, everybody who have been coming to our Psych Talks and our previous events. We really appreciate it. Today's Psych Talk is a little bit special. We have an HSU alumni as well as the president co-founder of SOAR. Thank you, Ali, for being here today. We are excited to hear about your research. A little bit about Ali Jaurique, is that correct?
That's better than how I pronounce it, so yeah.
Okay. Ali Jaurique received her master's in academic research from Humboldt State University with an emphasis in social psychology. Currently, Ali is a doctoral candidate in social psychology at Syracuse University in New York, working with Dr. Sarah Burke. Her research focused on intergroup relationship, prejudice, and discriminations from a social identity perspective. Specifically, she is interested in the psychological antecedents of prejudice towards people with multiple marginalized identities, such as transgender women. Without further ado, please help me welcome Ali. Take it away, Ali.
Can you see my PowerPoint? And hear
Yes.
me? Okay.
Yes.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay. There. Now I can see a few faces. Okay. So just to start off, I'm in New York, so it's 7 p.m. So bear with me. It's weird doing a presentation like when it's so dark. But okay, so today I'm going to be talking to you about generally perceptions of gender and sexual minorities. I'm going to go over two studies that I've done that looked at, in particular, transgender people. Oh, that didn't work. Okay, so first, before I get started, I just want to clarify some language that I'm going to use, just in case anyone's not familiar. So transgender, you might have heard of that term before, but if not, transgender is a term to identify a person whose gender identity does not match the biological sex that the doctors assigned them at birth. So if a person was assigned male at birth, but is a woman and identifies as a woman, then they would be a transgender woman. And cisgender means that a person's gender identity matches their biological sex assigned at birth. So if you were born male and identify as a man, then you would be considered cisgender. So I'm going to use those words a lot in this presentation. If you have any questions about any other terms that I use, just ask. I am happy to answer questions during the presentation or at the end, however you normally do it. And I heard that somebody is going to be monitoring the chat for me, so I do not have that up. Okay, so let's get into it. Why study transgender people? Why have I decided to do that? Well, transgender people experience disproportionate levels of discrimination, even compared to gay, lesbian, and bisexual people, and in many realms, such as employment, housing access, the criminal justice system, and in healthcare. In fact, 23% of transgender people report catastrophic levels of discrimination, which is defined as experiencing 3 or more major life-disrupting events due to bias and discrimination. And in particular, transgender women report the highest level of discrimination when compared to transgender men and gay, lesbian, and bisexual people. So not just in comparison to cisgender people or straight people. So hearing those sort of statistics made me really interested in studying transgender people more, and I have been for the last couple of years. I'm briefly going to just go over what research has already happened or what's out there already. So some, the animations didn't work. Okay, well, hopefully the future animations work on this. So I'm just going to talk about some predictors of transgender prejudice. There are a lot more than this. These are just the ones that I find particularly interesting and have a decent amount of evidence behind them already. So there's been a lot, well, maybe, I don't know if it's fair to say a lot, but there's an increasing amount of research examining predictors of transgender prejudice, or in other words, research that's trying to determine under which conditions people's perceptions of transgender people change. So the first one I'm going to talk about is symbolic threat. Symbolic threat involves a person's perception that other people in some group hold values or beliefs, whether it be religious, cultural, whatnot, that are incompatible with those of the perceiver. So for example, if somebody identifies really strongly with being American or American culture, they might feel symbolically threatened or perceive immigrants as a symbolic threat. Research has examined this with transgender people and has found that some people perceive transgender people as a symbolic threat to their core beliefs about gender. So a threat to their beliefs that gender is a binary and that gender is a category that one is born into. So that is a pretty big predictor of transgender prejudice. Another is contact. So contact with groups with which you're not a member of has been found to be a predictor of less prejudice toward the group that you've had contact with in a lot of different intergroup contexts. But people have studied it with transgender people and have found consistently that the more contact one has with transgender people, the less likely they are to be prejudiced towards transgender people. And then we have perceptions of choice, which is a really big one with transgender people and also with gay, lesbian, and bisexual people. So some people hold the belief that transgender people have chosen to be transgender. And so people who endorse that belief, who believe that it's a choice, have or report more prejudice and discrimination towards transgender people. Those are three of the big ones that are more theoretical. We also have a lot of demographic characteristics that predict prejudice against transgender people. And that's what I'm going to focus on today. So we have things like age, where people who are older are more likely to be prejudiced against transgender people, people who are higher in religiosity, regardless of the religion, so not just in Christianity, report more prejudice. And then importantly, what we're going to be talking about today is gender as a predictor. So men can very consistently report more prejudice against transgender people. This has been studied quite a lot in terms of quite a lot compared to other things that have been studied for transgender people. Maybe not a lot considering, sort of other subfields. But it's very consistent that men report more prejudice against transgender people than women. And also there is fairly consistent evidence that people who are Republicans or conservatives in general report more prejudice against transgender people as well, compared to Democrats or generally liberal people. And those are the two demographic predictors that we're going to talk about today. The first study we'll talk about gender or men as a group, and then we'll talk about political affiliation. So we talked about the predictors of transgender prejudice, or predictors that affect or are related to changing perceptions of transgender people. But there's also a lot of different outcomes that you can study in terms of negative outcomes for transgender people, not just general prejudice, but other things like hate crimes. As I said at the beginning, transgender people experience a lot of discrimination. They also experience high levels of hate crimes, and they are probably very severely underreported. 57% of transgender people feel unsafe calling the police. And there are a lot of other statistics that show for transgender people and for sexual minority people as well, that there is hesitancy to report hate crimes due to concerns about backlash. There we go. Then we also have discrimination. So discrimination can be assessed by collecting more data on samples of transgender people and their experiences, which can be pretty difficult to get sort of specialized samples like that. But discrimination can also be studied by studying the responses that people have who work in different domains. So for example, if you wanted to study discrimination towards transgender people while traveling, you might get a sample of people who are TSA agents to describe how they might respond to a person whose visual gender appearance doesn't match the gender that's reported on their documentation. And you can examine how people in those domains might respond to transgender people and get a sense of how transgender people are experiencing discrimination in the real world. Then we have stereotype endorsement, which is another common outcome that people measure. So for example, there are a lot of general stereotypes about transgender people, such that they're mentally ill, which has been fueled by the requirement for transgender people to get a mental disorder diagnosis in order to receive any sort of gender confirmation treatment. There's also stereotypes about transgender women, that they are considered to be gay men, or stereotypes particular to gay men, that they are lesbian women, and those sorts as well. So a common way to study this is to have participants actually self-report how true they think these stereotypes are, and or for them to generate their own stereotypes about transgender people as a way for researchers to understand which are the most salient in people's minds. But the two that I'm going to talk about the most today are miscategorization and then just general prejudice and negative evaluations. So miscategorization has two main types. There's indirect miscategorization and direct miscategorization. So indirect miscategorization is when someone insinuates that a transgender person is not a member of the gender group that they identify with. So an example of indirect miscategorization is misgendering somebody. So, using he, him pronouns for a transgender woman. That would be considered indirect miscategorization. Direct miscategorization, on the other hand, is when somebody blatantly identifies or categorizes a transgender person as a gender or sex that they do not identify with. So an example of that is if I show you or ask you to read a scenario about a transgender woman and then ask you to report whether that person is a man or a woman, and you say that they are a man. That's direct miscategorization. Miscategorization has not been studied very much in the field of researchers who are already looking at or studying transgender people. But this distinction is there, and surprisingly, direct miscategorization is very, very common. And direct miscategorization is what we'll be talking about today. I see that there's chats in there. I can see the notification. So if you want to interrupt me and ask me that or anything, feel free. But I don't have the screen up, so I can't look. So then we have just prejudice and negative evaluations. So the way that we measure these are usually things like self-reported negative evaluations, just asking people's attitudes, like how warm or cold they feel towards a group, so towards transgender people. You can also measure things like preferences for social distance, which is like a whole new thing that you have to explain when you talk about these things now since the pandemic, because social distance means something totally different than it did a couple years ago. So I don't mean social distance like in the COVID, necessarily in the COVID sense, but just preferences for not being friends with people or wanting to be in the same group as them and those sorts of things. So not COVID related, even though the word is the same. And then another way that you can potentially study prejudice or negative evaluations is just looking at respect and tolerance as well. So how much people respect transgender people and tolerate transgender people as well. Before I get into the first study, I just want to talk also about the importance of comparison groups and the comparison groups that I'm going to be talking about today in these two studies. So when studying transgender people, you typically would want to have some sort of comparison group in order to make claims saying that transgender people are, experiencing more prejudice than another group. And so the most obvious groups are other gender groups, so cisgender people compared to transgender people, so you can make that comparison. And that's what I do in the first study. And then in the second study, I'll be talking about comparison to sexual minority groups. So even though transgender people are a gender minority, not a sexual minority, they're often lumped together under the LGBTQ plus acronym. So it's useful to still compare transgender people to sexual minority groups because they are so connected in people's minds. Okay, so this isn't like a real theoretical model. This is just the way that I like to think about it when I'm thinking about the predictors and the, I just saw that Lily is joining the meeting. So predictors and outcomes. So the predictors that we talked about, this is not exhaustive, are context, symbolic threat, choice, demographic characteristics, things like that. And those affect or are related to, shifting perceptions of transgender people. And then those perceptions can manifest in different things like discrimination, stereotypes, miscategorization, and prejudice. And today we're going to be talking about demographic characteristics as predictors, and then we'll talk about miscategorization and prejudice. Okay, study 1. So the aims of this study were to examine miscategorization and other negative outcomes, which I won't get into. I'm going to focus on miscategorization here. And related to men's perceptions of transgender people after experiencing a threat to their masculinity. Also going to look or explore how men's identification with their gender group might predict miscategorization of transgender people as well. The participant demographics for this study were that there were 453 self-identified cisgender heterosexual men. So this is one of those demographic characteristics that predict prejudice towards transgender people. So we decided to just focus in on cisgender men and look at their miscategorization and their attitudes towards transgender people. And future research will, collect a sample of cisgender heterosexual women as well and compare them, but I do not have that for you today. This is just cisgender heterosexual men, 80% white, mean age 35, and it is a non-college student sample. We collected it through Prolific. So just go through the design really quick. The first independent variable was prototypicality threat. So for this, we gave participants a quote unquote gender knowledge inventory. And this is where they answered a bunch of questions, like about 35 questions that were stereotypically, feminine or stereotypically, I don't know if you can see my air quotes, but I'm not saying that they are actually feminine or masculine. They're fake questions. It's a fake survey. It's, none of it is real. Then they receive false feedback, and if they're in the threat condition, they're told that their answers were more like women's answers, and if they were in the no threat condition, they were told their answers were more like men's answers. So remember, this is all a sample of men. This manipulation did not end up doing anything. So this is the only time I'm going to talk about it, but I had to still mention it because it was part of the study. So I didn't want to lie and say that it wasn't. It was part of the study. The second independent variable was the profile type. So this is where we manipulated the gender of the person in the in a Facebook About You section, which I'll show you in a few slides. So they saw a transgender person, a cisgender woman, and a cisgender man. And then we manipulated the gender of the transgender target. So this is where they were randomly assigned to either see a transgender woman or a transgender man. There we go. So prototypicality threat was a between subjects variable where people were randomly assigned to it. Profile type was within subjects. So every participant saw three different profiles. They saw a transgender person, they saw a cisgender woman, and they saw a cisgender man. For the transgender person group, they were randomly assigned to either see a transgender woman or a transgender man, because we didn't think it would be realistic to say, you know, here's 4 and 2 of them happen to be transgender, but no, don't think that we're studying transgender people. So they only saw one transgender person, and it makes the design of the study kind of complicated, but hopefully I can, you know, make it not seem complicated. So transgender target, their gender was between subjects or between groups. So examples of the way that, or the groups that people might see. So they might see a transgender woman and then a cisgender woman and then a cisgender man. And then a different person might see a transgender man, then a cisgender man, then a cisgender woman. So the transgender target was always the first person, and then the cisgender targets were the second and third profiles they saw, and those were randomized, the order in which every participant saw them. We also had 4 different names for the people in the profiles and 3 different hobbies. So you can imagine it gets to be a lot of different profiles very quickly. But we did that to kind of try and keep everything, you know, random. And also because they were seeing 3 different profiles, every individual participant was seeing 3 different profiles. So obviously they couldn't all have the same like hobby or the same name. These are examples of what the profiles looked like that they saw. These are just the transgender ones. So for the transgender targets in their About You sections for Facebook, they had a sentence at the end of their About You section that said, on a personal note, I'm a transgender woman. I was born male, but I identify and have been living my life as a woman for many years. And then vice versa for the transgender man. For the cisgender targets, we did not have a sentence like that because we thought it would be weird because cisgender people don't generally talk about their gender identity in that way. So they just didn't have anything. And research shows that, you know, if you don't give, you know, if you don't say that somebody is transgender, then people are automatically going to assume they're cisgender anyway. So we were just kind of banking on that. Then for our measures, we had group identification, and these are some of the items. This measure was presented before all the manipulations. So if anyone was going to wonder that when I show the results later, they did do their group identification before any of the manipulations, before rating any of the profiles or anything like that. But I just put it here to make more sense. And then the main outcome was categorization. So when they saw the profile of the target, we measured direct miscategorization. So they saw a profile and they answered a bunch of questions, but for this talk, I'm just talking about categorization. But for every profile, after they saw the profile, they would rate, there we go, from strongly agree to strongly, or strongly disagree to strongly agree, how much they agree with the statement. And there were a bunch of them, like this person is a United States citizen, or this person is middle-aged, or this person. So we had a lot of fillers as well, and ones that also might seem weird to ask. So like in the profile, they don't say anything about being from the United States or being middle-aged or anything like that, but we still ask them. And we said at the beginning that if you are reading it and you don't remember them mentioning that, then just make your best guess, hoping that that would mean that on these items, they would make their best guess of whether they, whether the person was a man or a woman. And we did ask it on a scale. So we were able to get some variation rather than just a, you know, is this person a man in that dichotomous measure? So we were able to get some variability there, which was cool. Okay, the results. So the first basic results are that people miscategorize transgender men and women a lot. So you can see here, just orient us to the graph. This is people's responses to the statement, this person is a man, and these are the different target genders. So cisgender men, people, you know, very high up there, we're saying that yes, this person is a man. For transgender men, it was a little bit lower, and all of these, I mean, clearly are significant differences here. So transgender men were significantly perceived as less likely to be a man, and then transgender women, and then cisgender women. So it's important, even though this person is a man, so we might just look at the difference between cisgender and transgender men. It's also important to note that there's a difference between transgender women and cisgender women. So cisgender women are very low at the bottom of this of the scale, where they were perceiving cisgender women as not being men. But for transgender women, they were perceiving them significantly more as being men compared to cisgender. And then it is exactly flipped for the other item. So for this person is a woman, cisgender women were perceived the highest there, then transgender women, then transgender men, and then cisgender men. Then the group identification results. Sorry, let me take that. Okay, so hopefully you can see this. But let's orient ourselves to the graph first, because it is a lot. So here on the y-axis, we have this person is a man, again, so these are the same two categorization items. And then on the x-axis here, we have group identification. The different lines, the different colors are the different gender groups. So here we can see that up here is cisgender men. They're perceived, you know, highly as being men. And there's not a significant association between group identification and perceptions of cisgender men as men. And similarly down here with cisgender women, they are rated very lowly on the perception that they're men. And group identification is not associated with perceptions that cisgender women are men either. So for the cisgender targets, group identification doesn't have any sort of relationship with perceptions of their gender categorization. But where it gets interesting is with the transgender targets. So if you look, the green line here, I think, can you see my mouse when I like, okay, I'm never sure. So you can see the green line here, we're looking at transgender men, and remember this is categorizing them as men. And when the men are low in group identification, it's about the same as for cisgender men. But as group identification gets higher, as they identify more with their group, the less they are likely to categorize the transgender men as men, and the more likely they are to categorize the transgender women as men. So group identification is positively associated with perceiving transgender women as men and negatively associated with perceiving transgender men as men. So that indicates to us that group identification plays a really important role here. And just like the last two graphs, it is completely flipped for the item, this person is a woman. So here, for at the top is cisgender women, because this is categorizing them as women. And you can see that there's no association between group identification and categorizing cisgender women as women, and no relationship between group identification and perceiving cisgender men as women. But again, as group identification increases, perceptions that transgender women are women go down, and perceptions that transgender men are women go up. So why is this important? Well, there's my, okay. Well, miscategorization, this is evidence that miscategorization of transgender people is pervasive. Miscategorization is very understudied in social psychology, which can be kind of surprising because I feel like outside of the research world, just you hear a lot about misgendering and pronouns and those sorts of things. But there is just now in like the last couple of years really that people are focusing on miscategorization of transgender people as an outcome, and also looking at miscategorization and the negative effects of that. Oh, nope, don't do that. Also, we found that the more that a man identifies with this group, the more likely he is to miscategorize transgender people. So there's two potential, well, I'm sure there's many more than two potential arguments for this, but two that I think of a lot. One is that just in general, when people strongly identify with groups, that increases their tendency to police the boundaries of that group. And they, are more likely to attempt to push out people who are threatening the sort of uniformity of the group, which transgender people can be perceived as sort of muddying the ground, like muddying the difference between men and women. That's a perception that some people have. It might be make men more likely to miscategorize the transgender people. But in this context, remember, we're talking about men. So group identification or stronger group identification when it comes to gender is, to me, is kind of different than the way we categorize, like strong group identification with something like political party or something. So when you strongly identify, or research has found that when men identify strongly with their group, they're more likely to, or their group as in their gender group, so identify more strongly with being men and that sort of, those sort of roles, they're more likely to have a binary view of gender. They're more likely to oppose gender neutral pronouns and language, and have been found to be, more prejudiced against non-binary people as well. So I think that kind of is the direction that I have been leaning towards in terms of the argument for this, for why group identification is having this effect. And I think it'll be really interesting to continue on and do future studies looking at women and how potentially group identification might increase or potentially might increase or have a different effect on their categorization of transgender people, and see if this is something that is unique to men. Also, this is of course important because miscategorization and being miscategorized is related to a whole host of negative outcomes like negative affect, less authenticity, and more anxiety, more depression, and those sorts of things as well. So it's important to be studying for those very practical reasons as well. Okay, so study two is not a continuation of study one. It is a different study that is also looking at transgender people and sexual minorities that I just thought would be interesting to put with this. So this is in no way like a second study to the first one, if you're wondering why it kind of seems so different. So for this one, I'm focusing on the demographic group of political affiliation. So the aim of this study was very, very broad. And I am just picking a very, very small section of what this study was to talk to you about today. So the aim of the overall study was to look at how Americans' attitudes and opinions and beliefs changed before or after the presidential election. But for this study, I am just pulling out like you know, 1% of it, and just going to be looking at attitudes towards transgender people and respect toward transgender and sexual minority groups. Just some quick background on the study. This was a, what's the word? Pre-post study. So we collected data 2 weeks before the 2020 election and 2 weeks after the 2020 election. And at time 1, we had 811 participants, and at time 2, we had 774. And those are the same participants. So we're able to get people's attitudes, like their actual attitudes, changing after the election. For political affiliation, it was a little bit, it's going to take a few minutes to get down to what we ended up doing with political, or what I ended up doing with political affiliation for this. So generally, we just, like in the actual study, we just asked what political party they identify with. So Republican, Democrat, Independent, Green Party, Libertarian, or other. And then if they reported anything other than Republican or Democrat, we asked them this question. So this question is basically just telling them, okay, we understand that you're not identifying as a Republican or Democrat, but we also understand that people generally lean to one side or the other. So please tell us which one is closer to you. Like which one is closer to your political beliefs. And they had to say whether their beliefs were closer to Republicans or Democrats. So they don't identify as Republican or Democrat. They just are saying their political leanings are closer to that. And these are the sample sizes at time 1. So for ease of presentation, I'm just going to be talking about time 1 data, but the same effects happen for wave 2, which is why I'm simplifying it by just talking about wave 1. So here we had 287 Democrats, 289 Republicans, and 206 independents. We were kind of surprised at how many independents we had, so I kind of wanted to include them in the analysis. But I thought, let's look at that other question we asked them first, because, you know, who knows? Maybe all of the independents are more likely to be Republican or something. Well, that didn't happen. What happened was really cool and exciting is that actually a pretty even split, that for independents, about 100, or not about, exactly 103 of them said that their political leanings were more towards Democrat, and 100 of them said their political leanings were more towards Republicans. So I thought, that's really cool. Why don't we do something with that? So what I did was I added those to a variable, and political affiliation then became 4 groups: Democrat, Republican. So those are people who actually self-report identified as Democrat or Republican. And then I made these 2 new categories, which were independent Democrat leaning and independent Republican leaning. I am very sure that the independents would not be happy that I am categorizing them that way, but I'm doing it. So these are the 4 groups that we're going to look at and look at the differences between their attitudes. Other participant characteristics, so we did it through Qualtrics panels, and there were about 90% white, about 58% men, 90% straight. So, you know, not hugely diverse, but we tried. So then here's the measures. This was a correlational study, so there's no independent variables or anything manipulated. So we just measured some things. The 2 main outcomes that I'm going to talk about today are warmth and respect. Warmth is just kind of like our general attitudes measure. So we asked them, please indicate how cold, negative, unfavorable, or warm, positive, or favorable you feel toward each of these groups. And then we asked them way more than the 3 groups I'm going to be talking about today. But so on this scale, on warmth, low numbers mean cold and high numbers mean warm. And then for respect, we asked them, how much do you respect the members of the following groups as equals? 1, not at all, to 7, completely. The 3 groups that I have for you today are straight people, gay, lesbian people, and transgender people. So let's talk about the fact that we combined gay and lesbian people into one term. This was a very big study, and this was a very small part of it. And there was a lot of hours spent trying to reduce the number of items and reduce the measures and everything. So we decided that using gay/lesbian people as one term made the most sense. You know, there's all sorts of conversations that we can have about, you know, using gay/lesbian, using, you know, just gay, using homosexual, using, you know, and how that relates to the terms that we use for the other groups and stuff. But if you want to have that conversation, I would love to, just, you know, email me. But for this, the grouping is gay, lesbian people and transgender people, and then the comparison to straight as well. Let me check my time. Okay. So the results. Okay, what we have here is warmth. So I'm going to start with warmth, and we're looking at each political party down on the x-axis. So Democrat, independent Democrat leaning, independent Republican leaning, and Republican. And then the target groups go straight, gay, lesbian, and then transgender. Here you can see for Democrats, the straight targets were evaluated more warmly than the gay and lesbian targets, and the gay and lesbian targets were evaluated more warmly than the transgender targets. And so this is where for self-identified Democrats. Interestingly, for independent Democrat leaning, these were not significant differences between these two, but there was a significant difference between straight and transgender. For independent Republican leaning, we have a very significant difference between their warmth towards between straight people and gay and lesbian people. And then there is also a significant difference between their their warmth toward transgender people is significantly lower than towards gay and lesbian people. And then finally, for Republicans, we have, again, a very significant difference in their warmth between straight people and gay and lesbian people, and then also a significant difference where they significantly rate transgender people more coldly than they do gay and lesbian people. And then a very similar pattern is shown for respect. So everything on this graph is the same, except for the values now are for the respect outcome. Here for respect for Democrats, we do have a significant difference between their respect towards straight people and compared to gay and lesbian people, but no difference for Democrats between gay and lesbian and transgender people. For independent Democrat leaning, we have no differences between any of them. And then, not unsurprisingly, for independents Republican leaning, we have a significant difference in their respect for straight people compared to gay and lesbian, but then no difference between gay and lesbian and transgender. Finally, matching the last graph, we have a very significant difference between where they respect gay and lesbian people a lot less than straight people. They also respect transgender people a lot less than straight people, or sorry, than gay and lesbian people. Well, also compared to straight people too. So I have another way to look at it, and I think I might have enough time, and I think some of you might be interested in it, so I'm going to show you really quick. So these are going to be the same numbers. These are the same means and everything, but instead we're going to look at how the different political parties compare for each outcome group. So here it's very interesting. Well, to me, it's very interesting that for straight people, there was no differences between any of them. They all evaluated straight people about the same. Here we have also for gay and lesbian people as the outcome, Democrats and independent Democrat leaning do not have a significant difference in their warmth rating. We're talking about warmth again here. And then independents Republican leaning and Republicans don't have a big difference or don't have a significant difference either. So the independents don't differ very much in compared to the side that they lean towards. And then the same thing for transgender people. There was no difference between warmth between Democrats and independents who are Democrat leaning in their warmth toward transgender people. And then there were no difference between independents Republican leaning and Republicans, which I think is pretty interesting. And then the same thing for respect. So here we do have a difference between just Democrats and Republicans in their respect towards straight people. I don't know how to explain that, so don't ask me. But for gay and lesbian people, we have this same sort of pattern where the independents who are leaning toward Democrat or the independents who are leaning Republican aren't differing in their respect towards gay and lesbian people. And then the same thing for transgender people here as well. So what I am taking, well, actually, I'll do that next. So why is this important? First, this is evidence from a non-college sample that people feel less warmth and less respect towards transgender people, even compared to gay and lesbian people. So not just compared to straight people, which would be the common comparison group. And independents who lean Democrat and independents who lean Republican don't differ much from Democrats and Republicans respectively in their attitudes towards sexual and gender minorities, which I think is really interesting because I'm saying this outside of research. I think that independents might push back against that a little bit. And I mean, this is data, so they can't push back too much, but I think they might push back saying, there are multiple reasons why they might identify as independent, even if they're, more liberal or more conservative. But in the end, for the groups, at least that I'm focusing on, there's not much difference for independents when you take into account their, ideology. For the main takeaways here, what I'm hoping you will take away from this whole presentation, first, is that miscategorization of transgender people is pervasive. My data, at least, is showing among men, other data showing among everyone. And that stronger identification with being a man predicts more miscategorization. I also want you to keep in mind demographic characteristics like gender and political affiliation can be important predictors of miscategorization and of prejudice towards transgender people in general. But I'm really going to try and drive home this miscategorization aspect so more people kind of get into it. And then finally, what I think is a really big takeaway from this is that it's important to distinguish between gender and sexual minority groups in our research because their experiences are not always the same. And things have been getting a lot better. It's been changing a lot over the past couple of years, but in general, oftentimes people will group LGBT people together. And so saying if they have a sample of gay and lesbian people, and then they might say, this is evidence of, negative attitudes or something towards LGBT people in general. But I think it's really important to differentiate and make sure you're very clear in the groups that you're talking about, because the experiences are not the same. And as I've shown you over the last two studies, that transgender people are experiencing a lot more prejudice or a lot more negative evaluations compared to even gay and lesbian people, which some people might not expect that. So I think it's very important to make sure to differentiate between all of these groups and continue to study them more closely. Oh no, of course, my last slide is not going to click. There we go. So I want to thank my collaborators that have worked on this project or both of these projects with me. I definitely could not do it without them, and my advisor, Sarah Burke, and specifically Heather Smith and Desiree Ryan, who are here right now. So I'm going to call them out and say thank you. And also thank you to all of you for listening to me talk today. I hope you found it interesting. If you have any questions, I think I barely left. Okay, I left a few minutes. So I'm happy to answer questions, but I'm also really happy to email, like if you have any questions or want to know more or anything like that, please just email me. I'm always excited to talk about this stuff and talk about research. Okay, any questions? Should I look at the chat now? There's 8 things in here.
Well, thank you, Ali, for your talk. Please give Ali a round of applause. Thank you. There are some questions in the chat, if anyone, Jacob, go. Question.
Okay, thank you. So first of all, just like super freaking cool stuff. And thank you so much for spending your time and presenting on this for us. And then Gaffney did want me to do a couple of like little shout outs and stuff. And so she let me know that I was in the presence of a couple of different examples of royalty today. And so specifically to her first graduate students, Ben, Lily, and Olivia.
Saw their names coming in and I was like, what's happening?
she wanted to say that she misses you guys very much and she hopes all is well. But she is here, but she can't speak right now. And then personally, I was curious for research-wise, if for the first study you explored like the idea of like the exclusivity of femininity and how that might, because I don't know, was there a significant difference between the men's attitudes towards trans women and trans men? Because Gaffney and I have talked about it for my thesis work in terms of how there's like there's a particular difference between how cis men will view trans women as like intentionally or purposefully choosing to lower their status. I know, great.
Yeah, no, I know, yeah.
As opposed to the challenge that would come from trans men choosing to increase their status. And I didn't know if that came through in the research or not.
No, not in these studies. Not in that first study. I've thought about that a lot, definitely, as like another sort of potential explanation for some of the effects that I have found, but I haven't studied that yet. So if you are going to, that would be very cool.
We will be.
But yeah, no, and actually we didn't, so I only talked about categorization for this, but we also did measure things like just regular just evaluations and social distance, and we didn't find any differences in evaluations between transgender men and transgender women, which is something that I would have predicted along with my like prototypicality threat stuff that I didn't talk about very much. But one of the predictions there would have been that it wasn't that same argument, but the pattern matches that argument, where they would have more negative attitudes towards transgender women for, many theoretical reasons, but I haven't actually gotten to the point of like studying what the actual reasons are. I'm just doing studies trying to find differences kind of thing yet. Yeah. But yeah, I think that is a really great argument that somebody should study.
Like I said, we'll be in touch.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
There is another question in the chat from Heather Smith. Did you look at warmth and respect means by political affiliation within cisgender for the voting study?
No, I didn't. And I knew somebody was going to. No, wait. I did for cisgender, but not sexual orientation. So there were only, for that study, there were only, I think, 3 transgender people. So everyone else was cisgender, reported that they were cisgender. So those results are for cisgender people, but they're not necessarily just heterosexual people, because there are, well, it's 90% straight sample anyway, but I did not take the non-straight groups out of there.
So Allie, I was just wondering whether men and women differed. In other words, are Republican women?
Yeah,
As
I haven't looked at that yet. That is
okay,
the next step.
That's what I was curious about.
Yeah. No, I'm curious about it too. Like, that's literally my next step in this is just to look at that. But as we've seen, I already barely had time, so I didn't want to add it.
Yes, Maria?
Maria.
I thought I'd raise my hand instead of doing my usual interruption, because that's how I usually flow. So I have 2 questions. One that you hear most often when people are discussing, at least when I discuss with people about political affiliation, is education level, and how that has a huge thing to, like, certain education levels affiliate with certain groups. And I was wondering if you just happen to collect any of that kind of demographic info.
Oh yeah.
And have started like exploring interactions, because you know I love me those interactions.
Yes to the first part and no to the second part. Yes, we did. We did collect a lot of demographic information. So we have things looking at education and all sorts of other demographic groupings. So like things like whether they live in a rural area or an urban area, those sorts of things that are also, you know, shown to be predictors of prejudice. But I have not looked at those as interactions yet. But
Okay.
that is I will tell you when I do it.
Yes, please, because you
Yeah.
know I love me them interactions.
Yeah,
All right,
no, me too. Yeah.
And then my next question, kind of a little bit unlike what Heather was saying, but maybe not too much, is that from it's anecdotal from the interviews I've seen, but many people from the trans community state that the prejudice that they experience and discrimination isn't only from straight, but within the LGBTQ community itself. And so,
Oh yeah.
I don't know if you can or have started to sort of parcel that out with any of the data that you have. That some of it is even worse, because they're like, we're not even accepted within this group. And we get, we're a part of it, and or at least lumped with it. So just curious.
Yeah, Maria, that's literally my favorite thing to talk about. Well, that sounds bad. It's not. I'm not happy that it's happening, but that's where my dissertation is going to end up being. So no, I didn't, and I can't look at that sort of thing in these 2 samples, because we just don't have the data at all. But like, we don't have enough non-straight people to use them as a comparison to look at that. But for my dissertation preview, if I'm sure some of you will hear about it a lot eventually, that I am going to be looking at how like transgender people, but other groups within the LGBT community might feel different sorts of things, like deprived, relatively deprived, compared to other groups in the like LGBT plus community, and how that might, impact all sorts of outcomes, particularly collective action stuff, but other sorts of outcomes as well. So I definitely think, and totally, I think research also supports that, the very little that's out there. But yeah, I can't do any of that with these studies. There's just like not enough data, but I plan to.
Yay. Okay, so when you do it, let me know, because I'd be interested
Of course.
in the results.
Yes. I mean, that will be in a couple of years. So, but yes. Yeah.
Do we have any more questions for Ellie? We are at the hour.
Oh, here, somebody asked for my email, because oh gosh, how do I, everyone in the meeting. I'll put my email in the chat. So if you have any questions, email me. I love talking about this, as you might be able to tell. So yeah.
Cool.
Thanks for having me.
I have just want to say something. So Ali, I just want to thank you for this. Thank you for studying this. This is actually something I'm interested in. And so I'm just like, so instantly highlighting, I'm just like, yes, Dr. Thurman that gave me the idea, like, put planted the seed had years ago when I was HSU, maybe PhD. And now I'm just like, I'm hearing what you're doing. I'm like, this is interesting. So thank you for doing this research.
Of course. Yes. Thank you for listening and thinking it's interesting.
Awesome, cool. So if there aren't any more questions, this will conclude the recording and our Psych Talk. Thank you, Ali, and thank you everybody for coming. Appreciate it.